My name is Anna. I'm 68 years old, and I am about to tell you a story that explores something deeply human, the moment when your entire understanding of who you are suddenly shifts beneath your feet. This is a work of fiction, but it explores themes that are very real for many people. This is the story of an inheritance, an adoption, and a family that had to confront the lie they had been living for 68 years. My chest felt tight as I stood in my lawyer's office, holding a manila folder that had just been placed in my hands. The folder was thin, almost disappointingly thin for something that would change my entire life. Inside were documents, official documents, documents dated 1957, documents that explained why my mother and father had never quite looked like me, documents that explained why my father had always seemed slightly uncomfortable when people commented on my appearance. Documents that explained everything I had never been allowed to ask about. I was adopted. That was the simple fact. The simple, staggering, impossible fact that I was holding in my hands in the form of legal paperwork that was now over 60 years old. I had been adopted as an infant. My parents, the people I had called mom and dad my entire life, the people who had raised me, loved me, and then passed away within 2 years of each other, had never told me. They had taken the secret to their graves, and now I was inheriting $40 million. $40 million. The kind of number that doesn't feel real, that doesn't fit inside your mind, that seems like it must be a mistake. The inheritance had been from my father's side of the family, a trust that had been established decades ago, a trust that was meant to pass to his biological children and their descendants. But my father had no biological children except me. And now, with my parents both deceased, the entire $40 million was coming to me. Except the trust had a provision. There was always a provision in these situations. The trust specified that the inheritance would only pass to biological descendants of my father's bloodline. And according to the adoption papers I was holding, I was not a biological descendant. I was adopted, which meant technically that I had no legal claim to the inheritance. My lawyer, a woman named Sarah with reading glasses and an expression that suggested she had delivered bad news professionally for many years, explained the situation carefully. The adoption papers had been filed with the court, but apparently my parents had requested that the records be sealed. Sealed adoption records meant that the information was not readily accessible. The trust administrators had apparently not discovered the adoption during their initial review of my father's paperwork. But now that the adoption had come to light, I had discovered it while cleaning out my mother's storage unit after her death. The trust administrators were being forced to confront a legal complication. There were 2 possibilities, Sarah explained. The first possibility was that I would challenge the validity of the adoption records. Perhaps they had been filed incorrectly. Perhaps there was some legal ambiguity that could be exploited. Perhaps I could argue that I should be considered a biological heir regardless of the adoption status. The second possibility was that I would accept that I was not a biological heir and therefore had no claim to the inheritance. But there was a third possibility, and this was the one that Sarah leaned forward to emphasize. The third possibility was that the biological relatives on my father's side, the actual biological descendants of his bloodline, would challenge my claim to the inheritance. They would argue that since I was adopted, I had no legal right to the money. They would go to court, and they would probably win. I asked Sarah how likely this third possibility was. Sarah said it was very likely. She said that $40 million was too much money for biological relatives to ignore. She said that the moment the trust administrators informed the biological heirs about the complication, and they would have to be informed, those heirs would almost certainly hire their own lawyers and mount a challenge. I felt something twist inside my chest. I felt fear. I felt anger. I felt confusion. For 68 years, I had believed I was one thing. For 68 years, I had believed I was my father's daughter. And now I was learning that I wasn't, not biologically. And that biological fact, it seemed, was about to cost me $40 million. I asked Sarah what I should do. Sarah said that was my decision to make, but she recommended that I prepare myself for the possibility of legal action. She recommended that I gather any documentation that suggested my father had intended for me to be his heir, regardless of biology. She recommended that I consider the emotional and financial cost of fighting a legal battle that I might lose. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed in my apartment in Denver. a comfortable apartment that I had paid for with my own money, money that I had earned through my career as a social worker, and I thought about my parents. I thought about the fact that they had never told me I was adopted. I thought about what that meant. Did it mean they were ashamed of me? Did it mean they didn't consider me truly theirs? Did it mean they had been waiting for the right moment to tell me and that moment had never come? I thought about my father, especially. My father had been a quiet man. He had been kind but distant. He had worked in finance. He had built his wealth steadily over decades through careful investments and disciplined saving. When he died, suddenly, of a heart attack at 75, I had grieved, but I had also been relieved. That sounds harsh, but it's true. My father and I had never been particularly close. There had always been something between us, some distance, some reserve, and I had always assumed it was simply his personality, his nature, his way of relating to people. But now I understood. Now I understood that the distance might have been something else. It might have been guilt. It might have been discomfort. It might have been the distance between a man and a child who was not biologically his own, whom he loved, but whom he could never quite fully claim as his own, because he had made a choice, I assume, that my mother had insisted on, to never tell me the truth. 2 weeks after I received the adoption papers, I received a letter. It was from a law firm in New York. The letter was addressed to me and was marked personal and confidential. I opened it with trembling hands because I already knew what it would say. The letter informed me that I had been identified as a potential claimant to a trust established by my father. The letter also informed me that the trust administrators had been notified of certain complications regarding my eligibility. The letter went on to say that the biological heirs of my father's bloodline, specifically my father's cousins and their children, were contesting my claim. They were arguing that my adoption meant I had no legal right to the inheritance. They were offering me the opportunity to settle the matter without litigation. If I would voluntarily relinquish my claim to the trust, they would offer me a settlement payment of $5 million. $5 million to walk away from $40 million. I read the letter several times. I read it until the words started to blur together. And then I called Sarah. Sarah said that she had expected this. She said that $5 million was actually a reasonable settlement offer. It was 12.5% of the total inheritance, which was more than I might receive if I lost a legal battle. She said that I should seriously consider accepting the offer. But I didn't want to accept the offer. I wanted to understand who these people were. I wanted to understand who my biological relatives were on my father's side. I wanted to understand why they felt so entitled to this money that they were willing to threaten legal action to get it. So I did what I had been trained to do as a social worker. I listened. I called the lawyer who had sent the letter. I asked if it would be possible to speak directly with the trust beneficiaries. I asked if they would be willing to meet with me. And surprisingly, after a brief negotiation, they agreed. The family gathering took place in my father's house. Yes, I still had access to my father's house. It was technically part of his estate, and technically it would be part of the inheritance dispute. But for now, I was still living there while the legal matters were sorted out. The house was in Connecticut, a beautiful old colonial-style home that my parents had purchased in 1975 and had been maintaining ever since. It was the house where I had grown up. It was the house where I had the most memories of my father and mother. And now it was the place where I would meet the biological relatives I had never known existed. There were 7 of them. 7 people who shared my father's blood, but not my father's commitment to me. 7 people who saw me as a threat to their inheritance. There was my father's cousin Margaret, who was in her 70s. There were Margaret's 3 adult children, David, Susan, and Robert, all in their 40s and 50s. There were 2 of David's children, my father's great cousins, if you can call them that, who were in their 20s. And there was a lawyer named Mr. Harrison, who was representing the biological heirs. We sat in my father's living room. We sat in the room where I had celebrated Christmases as a child. We sat in the room where my father would read the newspaper every Sunday morning. We sat in the room where my mother would entertain her book club friends once a month. And now we sat as adversaries, as people fighting over money, as a family fractured by biology and law and the simple fact that I was adopted. Margaret spoke first. She explained that nothing personal, but they had a legal obligation to their own bloodline to protect the inheritance. She explained that the trust had been very clear about biological descendants only. She explained that while they were sure my father had loved me, That didn't change the legal reality. The money belonged to them. It was their inheritance, and I had no claim to it. I listened to her, and I felt something shift inside me. I felt the weight of her certainty. I felt the power of her biological connection to my father, a connection that I apparently did not have. I felt the way she was able to dismiss me, to see me as an outsider, to frame this as a simple matter of law and blood. And then I asked her a question. I asked, "Did you ever meet my father?" Margaret seemed surprised by the question. She said that yes, of course they had family gatherings. They had seen each other at various family events over the years. I asked, "Do you remember what he was like? Do you have any memories of him that are meaningful to you?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said that yes, she remembered him as a quiet man, a man who kept to himself, a man who didn't seem particularly interested in family connections. I nodded, and then I told them all something. I told them that I had spent 68 years as my father's daughter. I had spent 68 years believing that I was his biological child. I had spent 68 years carrying his traits, his quirks, his mannerisms. And now I was learning that I wasn't his biological child. But that didn't change the fact that he was my father. That didn't change the fact that he raised me. That didn't change the fact that he left his money to me because I was his daughter. His daughter in every way that mattered except for the simple biological fact of blood. I told them that I had found something else in my mother's storage unit. I had found letters that my mother had written to my father over the years, letters that had never been sent, letters that were clearly meant to be private reflections. In those letters, my mother had written about her grief over not being able to have biological children. She had written about the decision to adopt me. She had written about how much she loved me. She had written about her fear that someday I would learn the truth and would feel betrayed, would feel like I didn't belong. I told them that my father had never opened those letters. They were clearly meant for his eyes only, but he had died before my mother had decided to share them with him. But I had read them, and I understood something that I don't think my biological relatives in that room could possibly understand. I understood that the reason my father and I had distance between us was not because he didn't love me, but because he was carrying a secret. He was carrying the weight of a lie that he and my mother had decided to tell. He was carrying the grief of knowing that someday this secret would come out, and it would hurt me. I told them that I wasn't going to fight them for the inheritance. I told them that they could have it. I told them that I would accept the $5 million settlement and I would sign away any claim to the trust. But I wanted them to understand something. I wanted them to understand that by fighting me for this money, by insisting that my biological status determined whether I deserved to inherit from my father, they were making a choice. They were choosing blood over love. They were choosing law over loyalty. They were choosing money over family. And I wanted them to understand that my father, if he could have known about this, would have been ashamed of them. After I said that, there was a long silence in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone just sat there, absorbing what I had said, thinking about what it meant. And then something unexpected happened. Susan, one of Margaret's daughters, a woman who had been quiet through the entire conversation, started to cry. She said, "This is wrong. This is completely wrong. Anna is right. Our uncle would be ashamed of us. We're fighting over money when we should be thinking about family. We're using the law to hurt someone who has already been hurt by the secret her own parents kept from her. This is wrong." Her brother David disagreed. He said that sentiment was all well and good, but the law was clear. The trust specified biological descendants. There was no ambiguity. They had a legal right to the money, and they had a legal obligation to pursue it. But Susan's words had created a crack in the consensus. Margaret's youngest child, Robert, said that he agreed with Susan. He said that the legal technicality didn't feel right. He said that it felt like they were punishing Anna for something that wasn't her fault. I watched as the family fractured in real time. I watched as my biological relatives argued among themselves about whether it was right to take the inheritance from me. I watched as the law, the simple, cold fact of biological relationship, competed with something deeper and more human, a recognition that what they were doing felt morally wrong. The silence in my father's living room stretched on for what felt like an eternity. I could see the conflict playing out on the faces of my biological relatives. I could see Margaret calculating, trying to understand how to manage a family that was suddenly no longer unified in its position. I could see David preparing arguments to defend his legal position. I could see Susan and Robert looking uncertain, like they had just realized that winning the money might cost them something more valuable. It was Margaret who spoke first. She said, "We need to discuss this among ourselves. We need time to think about what Anna has said. We need time to determine what the right thing to do is." She looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that I hadn't seen before. I saw doubt. I saw the recognition that what they were doing might not actually be right, even if it was legal. The meeting ended shortly after that. Everyone left. They had come from different parts of the country, and they all had to travel back home. But before they left, something remarkable happened. Susan came up to me, and she hugged me. She held me, and she said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we made you feel like you weren't one of us. You are. Whether the law says so or not, you are one of us." After they left, I sat alone in my father's house. I sat in that living room where I had spent so many childhood moments, and I thought about what had just happened. I thought about the fact that my biological relatives, people I had never met before this day, had begun to question whether the money was worth the moral compromise. I thought about the fracture that had appeared in their family unity. I thought about the power of conscience to override law, to override biology, to override the simple calculation of financial self-interest. But I also thought about something else. I thought about my father. I thought about all the years he had carried this secret. I thought about all the years he had maintained a distance from me because he was uncomfortable with the lie he and my mother were living. And I thought about the letters my mother had written to him, letters that suggested she had wanted to tell me, but my father had apparently asked her to keep the secret. I wanted to understand why. I wanted to understand what my father had been thinking. I wanted to understand what had motivated him to keep this secret from me for 68 years. So I did something that I probably should have done earlier. I called my father's lawyer. His name was Martin, and he had handled my father's legal affairs for the last 30 years of his life. I asked Martin if he would be willing to meet with me. I asked if there was anything in my father's papers or his correspondence that might explain his decision to keep the adoption secret. Martin agreed to meet with me, but he told me something that made my heart skip. He said that my father had left a letter, a sealed letter, a letter that was to be given to me upon my father's death, but only if I asked for it. My father's instructions had been very specific. Martin was to give me the letter if I ever asked about my adoption or about my inheritance, but if I never asked, the letter was to be destroyed unopened. My hands were trembling when Martin handed me that letter. It was written in my father's careful handwriting. It was dated the year before he died. It was thick, at least 10 pages, and I could tell that my father had put significant thought into what he wanted to say. I opened the letter and I read it. I read it with tears streaming down my face. I read it several times because the words were so significant, so heavy with meaning, that I needed to read them multiple times to truly absorb what my father was trying to communicate. My father wrote that he had loved me. He wrote that from the moment I entered his life, he had considered me his daughter. He wrote that the decision to keep the adoption secret had been one of the hardest decisions of his life. He wrote that he and my mother had made that decision because they believed it was in my best interest. They believed that if I knew I was adopted, I would feel like I didn't fully belong. They believed that if I knew I was adopted, I would spend my life wondering about my biological parents, grieving a connection that couldn't be replaced. They believed that if I knew I was adopted, I would feel like there was something wrong with me, something that had caused my biological parents to give me away. But my father also wrote that he had come to understand that this decision had been a mistake. He wrote that keeping the secret had created a distance between us that he had always regretted. He wrote that he had wanted to tell me so many times. He wrote that he had almost told me when I was 18, almost told me when I graduated from college, almost told me when I got married and then divorced. But he had made a promise to my mother that he would keep the secret, and he had honored that promise even though it cost him his relationship with me. My father wrote that the most painful part of keeping the secret was knowing that I was adopting his emotional distance, his reserve, his inability to fully relax around me. He wrote that I had never done anything wrong, but because of the secret, I had grown up thinking that something was wrong with me. He wrote that he could see it in my face sometimes, the confusion about why he wasn't more openly affectionate, why he wasn't more engaged, and he had wanted to explain, but he couldn't because of the promise he had made. And then my father wrote something that broke my heart. He wrote, "I am giving you this inheritance because you are my daughter, not because of blood, but because of choice. Your mother and I chose you. We chose to bring you into our family. We chose to raise you as our own. And I want you to know that that choice, that decision to make you ours, was one of the best decisions of my life. You are my daughter in every way that matters. You are my daughter in every way that the law can recognize, even though it takes a piece of paper to prove it. And I am sorry that I spent so much of our relationship hiding from that truth. I am sorry that I let the secret create distance between us. I am sorry that I couldn't find the courage to tell you face to face. But I want you to know, without any possibility of doubt, that you were wanted, you were chosen, you were loved. By the time I finished reading the letter, I was sobbing. I was sobbing not just for myself, but for my father. I was sobbing because I understood finally that all those years of distance between us had not been because he didn't love me. It had been because he was struggling with the burden of a secret. It had been because he was carrying guilt and shame about something that was not his fault, the decision he and my mother had made to protect me through silence. I sat with that letter for days. I read it over and over. And with each reading, my understanding of my father changed. I began to see him differently. I began to see him as a man who had been trying to do the right thing, even though his method was flawed. I began to see him as a man who had loved me, even though he couldn't express that love openly because of the burden he was carrying. And I made a decision. I called Margaret. I told her that I didn't want the $5 million settlement. I told her that I was rejecting the settlement offer. And I told her something else. I was going to fight them for the full inheritance, not because I wanted the money, but because I wanted to honor my father's wishes. I wanted to make sure that the court understood that my father had intended for me to be his heir. I wanted to make sure that biological relationship didn't override the choice my father had made to make me his daughter. My lawyer Sarah was shocked when I told her this. She said that I was making a huge mistake. She said that I didn't have a strong legal case. She said that fighting for the full inheritance would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately unsuccessful. But I had something that Sarah didn't have. I had my father's letter. I had his written testimony about his intention to make me his heir. I had his explicit statement that the inheritance was given to me because I was his daughter. Sarah looked at the letter, and she read it carefully. When she was done, she said, "This is powerful. This is very powerful. But it's also a question of interpretation. The trust says biological descendants. Your father's letter says he considers you his daughter. The court will have to decide whether your father's intent overrides the language of the trust." I asked Sarah if we could win. Sarah said honestly that she didn't know. She said that the law was unsettled on this question. She said that we might win or we might lose. But she said that if we did fight, we would have a stronger argument than she had initially thought. I decided to fight. I decided that I would go to court. I decided that I would force my biological relatives to confront not just the legal question of biology, but the moral question of what family actually means. The lawsuit took 18 months to resolve. 18 months of depositions, of document discovery, of arguments presented to the court. 18 months of my biological relatives and their lawyers arguing that the trust language was clear, that biological relationship was the only thing that mattered, that my adoption meant I had no legal claim to the inheritance. And 18 months of me and my lawyer arguing that my father's intention was clear, that he considered me his daughter, that the trust should be interpreted in light of his explicit wishes expressed in his letter. The judge, a woman named Judge Keisha Washington, who had been on the bench for 20 years, took 6 months to write her decision. When it finally came, when I finally read the judge's ruling, I understood that she had been grappling with something profound. She had been grappling with the question of what family means. She had been grappling with the tension between law and human relationship. The judge's decision was nuanced. She ruled that technically, the trust language specified biological descendants, which I technically was not, but she also ruled that the intent of the settler, my father, was sufficiently clear in his letter that he had intended for me to be treated as his heir. She ruled that the trust should be interpreted in a way that honored my father's wishes, and therefore, she ruled in my favor. I was entitled to the full $40 million inheritance. When I heard the ruling, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I had won. I felt something more complex. I felt validated. I felt like the court had recognized that my father had loved me. I felt like the court had recognized that family is about more than biology. I felt like my father's wishes had been honored, even though he was no longer alive to see it. But I also felt something else. I felt a responsibility. I now had $40 million, and I understood that money was a tool. It was a tool that could be used in many different ways. The question was how I wanted to use it. I called a meeting with my biological relatives. All 7 of them came. We met again in my father's living room, the room where we had first confronted each other, the room where I had told them about my mother's letters. I told them that I had won the lawsuit. I told them that I had been awarded the full inheritance. I told them that they had no legal claim to the money. But then I told them something else. I told them that I wanted to establish a scholarship fund. I told them that the fund would be in my father's name. I told them that the fund would provide educational opportunities to young people, particularly to young people who were adopted, who came from difficult backgrounds, who had experienced family trauma, but had managed to overcome it. But I also told them that I wanted to do something else with the money. I wanted to establish a foundation that would work with families on adoption issues. I wanted to create resources for families who were deciding whether to tell their children about adoption. I wanted to help families avoid the mistake that my parents had made, the mistake of thinking that silence was protection, when really it was just another form of distance. I told my biological relatives that I was leaving each of them $1 million in my will. I told them that this was not because I thought they had treated me fairly. They hadn't. But it was because I understood that they were also victims of the legal and biological categories that had divided us. I understood that they had been taught that blood mattered more than choice. I understood that they had been operating within a system that valued biology above all else. And I wanted to give them the gift of understanding that family is about more than that. Susan cried when I said that. Robert looked shocked. Margaret looked like she was wrestling with something inside herself. David looked angry, like he thought I was judging him. And I was, but I was also trying to offer him a way to understand that judgment as something coming from love rather than from malice. After the meeting ended, something unexpected happened again. Margaret asked if she could stay and talk to me privately. After everyone else had left, she sat down in my father's living room and she said, "I owe you an apology. Not for fighting you for the money. I was protecting what I thought was my family's interest. But I owe you an apology for what I said in that first meeting. I said that your adoption meant you weren't truly part of our family. That was wrong. That was cruel. And I think I said it because I was scared." I asked what she was scared of. She said, "I was scared that if blood didn't matter, if choice mattered more than biology, then I had to confront the fact that I had made choices in my own life, choices about my relationships, choices about my family that weren't always built on love. I was scared that recognizing you as truly one of us would mean recognizing that I had failed to recognize other people in my life as truly one of us." I listened to my cousin Margaret say this, and I felt something shift in me. I felt like the lawsuit, the legal battle, the entire conflict had been worth it, not just to honor my father's wishes, but to create the possibility of this kind of honesty. I felt like by fighting for my right to be recognized as my father's daughter, I had created the opportunity for my biological relatives to reconsider what family actually meant to them. Margaret and I talked for hours that afternoon. We talked about my father. We talked about her memories of him. We talked about what she regretted about their family relationships. We talked about what it meant to choose family, to recognize family, to honor family. And by the end of that conversation, Margaret and I had become something like real relatives. Not just biological relatives, but actual family, people who had chosen to see each other, to understand each other, to care about each other. 5 years later, I am managing the foundation I created, the one focused on adoption education and family support. I am also overseeing the Scholarship Fund, which has now provided educational opportunities to over 100 young people. The fund has a specific focus on supporting adopted young people who are pursuing higher education. It has a specific focus on creating community for people who have experienced the kind of family dislocation that I experienced. I have also rebuilt relationships with my biological relatives. Not all of them. David still seems resentful about the lawsuit, and I don't think we will ever be truly close. But the others have become genuine parts of my life. Susan and I have become close friends. Robert and his family have invited me to family gatherings. And Margaret, my cousin Margaret, who initially fought me for the inheritance, has become one of my closest confidants. Margaret tells me that recognizing me as truly part of the family forced her to reconsider all of her family relationships. She tells me that it made her a better mother, a better daughter, a better person. She tells me that my fight for my right to be recognized as my father's daughter ended up giving her something she didn't know she needed: permission to love more openly, to choose family more consciously, to build relationships based on recognition and choice rather than just on biology and obligation. I have also spent time researching my biological family, the family I was adopted from. This was something my parents had always discouraged. This was something that I had felt too much pain to pursue while my father was alive. But after his death, after reading his letter, after winning the lawsuit, I felt like I had the emotional stability to do it. I learned that my biological mother was a young woman who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock in a time when that was considered shameful. I learned that she had made the courageous choice to allow me to be adopted by a family that could provide me with opportunities and stability that she couldn't provide. I learned that she had spent decades wondering about me, wondering who I had become, wondering if I was happy. I was able to contact her. I was able to meet her when I was 69 years old. I was able to tell her that I was okay. I was able to tell her that I had been loved. I was able to tell her that her decision to give me up for adoption had been a gift, not just to me, but to my parents, who had deeply wanted a child and who had loved me fiercely. My biological mother cried when I told her this. She told me that she had spent her whole life carrying guilt and wondering if she had made the right choice. She told me that meeting me, learning that I was okay, learning that I had been loved, that this was a gift she had never expected to receive. We have stayed in contact. We are not mother and daughter in the traditional sense. That role was filled by the woman who raised me. But we are family in a new sense. We are family because we have chosen to recognize each other. We are family because we have shared this fundamental experience of adoption and separation and the search for understanding. And through this experience, I have come to understand something about family that I didn't understand before. I have come to understand that family is not determined by a single factor. It is not determined by blood alone. It is not determined by law alone. It is not determined by choice alone. Family is determined by the intersection of all these things. Family is the people who raise you and love you and shape who you become. Family is the people who are bound to you by biology and genetics. Family is the people you choose to recognize and love. Family is the people who choose to recognize and love you. I have 3 families now. I have the family I grew up with, my parents who raised me and loved me, even though they kept a secret from me. I have the biological family I discovered as an adult, my biological mother, and the relatives I found through her. And I have the chosen family I built through the foundation, through the scholarship fund, through the years of working to help others navigate the complexities of family and identity. Each of these families has taught me something different. The family I grew up with taught me what it means to be loved despite distance, to be chosen despite complication, to be accepted despite secret. The biological family I discovered taught me that blood creates a connection that transcends time and separation, that the people who give birth to us are connected to us in ways that can't be erased by distance or time. The chosen family I built taught me that recognition is powerful, that honesty is healing, that the choice to see someone and to care about someone is the most profound form of love. I have learned that the inheritance I received was not just the money. The money was secondary. The real inheritance was the understanding that family is more complicated and more beautiful than the simple categories of biology and law. The real inheritance was the understanding that my father had loved me even though he couldn't express it openly. The real inheritance was the opportunity to build a life dedicated to helping others navigate the complicated landscape of family identity. And I have learned that sometimes the most painful experiences, the discoveries that shake us to our core, the battles we have to fight, the estrangement we have to endure, these experiences can become catalysts for something beautiful. These experiences can force us to confront what we really believe about family. These experiences can teach us to love more openly, to recognize people more fully, to build connections that are based on something deeper than biology or law or social convention. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed the way you understood everything? Have you ever had to reckon with a secret that altered the foundation of your identity? Have you ever had to fight for recognition, to insist that people see you as who you truly are, regardless of what the law or biology or tradition says? If you have, then you understand the power of this story. You understand that family is ultimately about the choice to see each other, to love each other, to recognize each other as truly belonging. And you understand that sometimes that recognition has to be fought for. Sometimes it has to be defended. Sometimes it has to be claimed with dignity and strength. This is what I have learned from my journey. This is what I want to share with you. Family is not determined by a single factor. Family is determined by love, by choice, by the decision to recognize each other as truly belonging. And that recognition, that choice, is the most powerful force in the world.